Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. Last weekend, my family had a nice little vacay in Park City, Utah. Since we were celebrating me for Mother's Day, I got to call most of the shots. While winding down one evening, I chose to watch a HULU original series called Wild Crime. To give a brief synopsis, Season 1 of Wild Crime covers a notorious murder committed in a national park. Convicted killer Harold Henthorn, aka the Black Widower. When his second wife Toni died from an accidental fall hiking in the Rocky Mountain National Park, her death raised suspicions about what actually happened to Harold's first wife, Lynn. So, naturally, I soaked in every detail of Murder in the Rocky Mountains, and I'm very excited to share it with you. Let's go back to the beginning. While attending college in Virginia, Harold Henthorne met a young lady named Lynn Rochelle at a wedding. The two hit it off and started dating. When Lynn introduced Harold to her friends and family, everyone thought he was an exuberant, confident, fun-loving guy. But as time went on, they realized what initially came off as enthusiasm was becoming overbearing. A family friend of Lynn's described Harold as having the personality of a car salesman. You felt the need to take a step back when he was speaking. But it didn't seem to bother Lynn. She was head over heels and married Harold in 1984. Soon after, he convinced her to move to Colorado. From the outside, their relationship seemed perfect, but in reality, Harold was extremely controlling. He was fully in charge of their finances. Lynn didn't even know how much money they had in their account. And apparently, the Bible teaches you to obey your husband. Pretty sure this is one reason Harold sought out Christian women. And don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying that is how all Christians live. The Bible is quite literally thousands of years old, and humanity has changed quite a bit since then. But some people do follow it to a T, and Lynn was one of them. Anyways, sometime during their marriage, Harold injured his back. He spent weeks lying on the couch with Lynn waiting on him hand and foot. And this was actually really hard on her because Lynn was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and took daily medication to help ease her constant pain. Harold's back improved enough that he could get around okay, but continued to be a problem throughout his life. And that's important to remember for later. Just one of the super strange things Harold did. He wouldn't allow Lynn to speak on the phone unless he was home. He insisted on listening in on the other phone while Lynn talked to her family members. I'm guessing to control what she had to say. Harold said their life was no one else's business, but Lynn did get a few private conversations with a friend over the years. She said Harold was pressuring her to have children. And as much as they tried, she never got pregnant. Lynn thought maybe her RA medications interfered with her fertility and was devastated she couldn't give Harold the children he wanted. Her friend was a shoulder to cry on, but didn't think much about what she said. But when Lynn died in a tragic accident, suspicions were raised. This is how it all went down, according to Harold. The evening of May 6, 1995, they were driving down a deserted highway when the right front tire of their Jeep felt spongy. He pulled over and decided to change the tire. Harold gets out the car jack and claims it wasn't working properly. I didn't find any details as to why. He conveniently happened to have a boat jack in his trunk. But a boat jack is very different from a car jack. It's basically a cylinder and would be unstable for a car. In this instance, unless the tire was completely flat, I would continue driving cautiously versus trying to change the tire with a boat jack. But Harold uses the boat jack and removes the lug nuts, handing them to Lynn. Then he carried the tire around to the rear of the Jeep and placed it in the back. This is when he heard a scream. Apparently, in the time he walked to the rear, Lynn crawled under the Jeep after a lug nut that she dropped, and the boat jack collapsed, crushing her. While Lynn's friends and family found the whole situation extremely fishy, her death was declared accidental and the case was closed. Harold did not openly tell people he was once married, but if the subject came up, he simply said his wife died in a car accident. Now, fast forward to Harold's second wife, Toni Bertollet. Toni grew up in a wealthy home, although it didn't start out that way. Her father struggled as a geologist but became successful when he started work in the oil and gas business. Toni thrived in most aspects of her life: academics, sports, music. She played instruments and sang soprano. If she put her mind to something, she was going to succeed. She went to medical school where she continued on to become an ophthalmologist. While in school, she met a dental student who eventually became her first husband. The marriage ended in divorce, and Toni threw herself into her work to keep her mind busy. Any spare time was spent at her local Baptist church. She sang in the choir and helped mentor other church members. When these things weren't enough to fill the void in her life anymore, she joined a Christian dating site. This is where she met Harold Henthorn. He worked as an independent fundraiser for nonprofit organizations, or so he said. When getting to know each other, Harold had a lot of questions about her career. It's normal to ask questions when dating, but Harold only had an interest in women with money. They decided to meet in person, and by the end of the weekend, Toni and Harold were engaged. A bit fast, but they both wanted children, and being in their 40s didn't want to waste any time. They married in the year 2000, going all out with a large guest list, fancy floral arrangements, and top-notch food. Toni sold her ophthalmology practice in Mississippi, and they relocated to Colorado, at Harold's suggestion, of course. Everyone believed that Harold wanted Toni separated from her family so he could gain control over her. Toni gave birth to a baby girl they named Haley. She was described as a very attentive and loving mother. Every year, Harold and Toni went on a trip to celebrate their anniversary. For their 12-year anniversary, Harold surprised her with a weekend in the Rocky Mountain National Park. He called Toni's office and asked the receptionist to clear her schedule and arranged for a friend to watch Haley. He packed her a bag and waited in the break room of her office. He had set up a camera to video her reaction. Harold looked way more excited than Toni. She seemed more confused. He could have surprised her at home, but instead he had this whole theatrical event planned for all of her coworkers to witness. Perhaps her confusion was because they weren't on the greatest of terms lately. Friends described Toni as seeming depressed and worn down. For years, she has dealt with Harold's overbearing, controlling personality. Like with his first marriage, he was in complete control of the finances. Toni received royalty checks from her father's gas and oil business. Her father discovered that the checks were being deposited by Harold. He confronted Toni and asked why she didn't have her own account for things like that. I think this conversation with her father made her realize how abnormal Harold's behavior was. She finally opened her own account, and moving forward, the royalty checks were deposited there. This didn't settle well with Harold. The day he surprised Toni, they left immediately from her office to Estes Park in the Rocky Mountains. That night, they stayed at a fancy hotel called the Stanley. The next day, they began their Deer Mountain hike, which was about 3 miles to the peak. According to Harold, they didn't even start their hike until 2 p.m., which seems strange because the sun starts to set around 6. That doesn't give them much time to hike the peak and back before it got dark. Saturday, September 29th, 2012, a 911 call was placed by Harold. He knew exactly where they were on this vast mountainside, gave specific instructions. Harold requested a helicopter because it would take at least an hour to get there on foot, but unfortunately the landscape did not provide a space to land a helicopter. By the time a ranger arrived, it was already dark. Harold claimed he was doing CPR the whole time. When the ranger assessed Toni, he said, "I'm sorry, but I think she's gone." Harold said, "I think so too." Harold described what happened to the ranger. He said Toni was standing near the edge taking a photo when she slipped and tumbled down a cliff. Luckily, park rangers and local police do fatality investigations even when it's assumed to be an accident. Cases like this are difficult because there are no witnesses. Harold and Toni were alone, and she isn't here to give her side of the story. The ranger in charge of this investigation found quite a few things that didn't add up. First of all, where Toni fell isn't a site along the trail. It's a ways off the beaten path, and unless you're an experienced hiker, it's considered very dangerous. Near her body, there were items lying right beside her, like her backpack, camera, and a boot that was untied. Typically, when a person falls from a great height, items would scatter, not land so close together, and a boot would fly right off, not untie itself. Because Harold claimed Toni was taking a photo when she fell, the camera was bagged into evidence. Another important item collected was a trail map found in Harold's car. The trail they were hiking that day was highlighted, including Deer Ridge that split off the main trail on Deer Mountain. On that ridge, Harold wrote the word hike and circled it. Then, right above the ridge on the map was an X. That X was pretty much the exact spot where Toni fell. This made sense as to how Harold described exactly where they were to the 911 dispatcher. If they randomly wandered off trail, it would be difficult to give directions. This case was handed over to ISB, the Investigative Services Branch, federal agents who step in when foul play is suspected in a national park. 2 days later, an agent went to Harold's home in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, to conduct an interview about the accident. They sat down together and reviewed pictures from the camera's memory card. He gave his account of what happened again. He said he didn't actually see Toni fall. A text came in from their nanny about his daughter's soccer game. He was looking at his phone when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that Toni was gone. The text from the nanny came in at 5:54 p.m. The 911 call was placed at 5:55 p.m. This had already contradicted Harold's original story. He told the park rangers he hiked down to Toni's body before calling 911, which took him about 45 minutes. And this made zero sense, by the way. Why waste 45 minutes hiking before calling for medical attention? Not sure if she needs it? She just tumbled 160 feet down a rocky cliff. I promise she needs help. The investigator showed Harold a copy of his trail map and asked why he highlighted Deer Ridge and what did the X represent. He had no response, just shrugged and handed the map back. I'm sure this was his first moment of, shit, I should probably have a lawyer present. He did indeed get himself a criminal lawyer, and that was the end of interviews with Harold. The photos on the SD card were closely examined for clues. They were able to pin down exactly where and when photos were taken using landmarks and timestamps. Harold said they hiked the trail until it plateaued. Then they turned left, walking to the cliff's edge for lunch with a view. Tracing their steps from the trail to the lunch spot was not easy. They would have been walking through some thick forest to get there. After lunch, they continued down the side of the mountain to the site where Toni fell. Harold said they did this because Toni saw turkeys and wanted to get closer. I don't know about you, but I'm not risking my life to get a better look at some wild turkeys. The ranger who interviewed Harold also found this comment very strange. Turkeys weren't commonly found in that environment. When the ranger questioned Harold about it, he said, "Oh, maybe it was a deer, not turkeys." Then he changed his story again, claiming they actually went down there for some, quote, romantic time. If this was true, there is plenty of space in the national park to do it that isn't the edge of a 160-foot cliff. Toni had multiple knee surgeries due to sports injuries. Her family members did not believe she would willingly hike this rocky terrain, knowing she would have to make her way back up. And what about Harold's bad back? Not to say people in their 50s can't be frisky, but doing so in this environment just didn't seem right. There are multiple photos of Harold standing on the edge of a cliff, gripping a tree branch for stability. The photos are in the exact same spot, but taken about 15 minutes apart. The theory is that he was posing while Toni took his photo and then tried to lure her to do the same. If you look straight up from the impact site of Toni's fall, you can see the tree Harold was gripping in those photos. A trail of blood showed that Harold dragged Toni's body about 8 feet from where she landed. Everyone knows when a person experiences trauma like this, you should never move them in case of a head or neck injury. And speaking of head injury, Toni was obviously pretty beat up, but one wound in particular stood out. She had a severe laceration on her head. The doctor who performed the autopsy said it resembled a scalping. She was bleeding profusely from her head, but her cause of death was asphyxiation due to trauma. Her lungs collapsed from the impact on the rocks. Harold never mentioned her head wound or how much she was bleeding on the 911 call. Other things that didn't add up in Harold's story. He told the dispatcher he was performing CPR the entire time while waiting for the ranger to arrive. First of all, giving CPR correctly is extremely tiring. That is why EMS typically trade off after a few rounds of compressions. And if he were giving mouth-to-mouth with the chest compressions, her lipstick would be smeared. It was pristine. No sign he gave her mouth-to-mouth at all. Harold hung up on the 911 dispatcher, claiming that he wanted to preserve the battery on his phone, but then he continued to use it. He texts back and forth with Toni's brother Barry, who's a surgeon. His first text was sent at 6:16 p.m., and these are all separate 2 to 3 word messages. Barry, urgent. Toni is injured. In Estes Park. Fall from rock. Critical. Requested flight for life. EMT Rangers on the way. Please come to Denver next flight. Low cell bat. Please return message. I find it strange to be texting in this manner. I think it would be much easier to just make a phone call. Barry wasn't the only person he contacted. There were 98 messages back and forth on Harold's phone during the time he was waiting for help. Must have had a decent amount of battery life after all. Furthermore, Harold took the time to build a fire. He said it was to signal for help, but it was probably to keep himself warm when the sun went down. The days following Toni's death, Harold started planning her memorial service. He somehow had a video montage already put together. This would take a lot of time to sift through photos, picking memorable moments to create a slideshow. Yet, in between police interviews and constant visitors, he got this done very quickly, almost like it was previously prepared. At the service, he did not portray a grieving husband. He didn't cry or get up to say anything about Toni. He insisted that Toni wanted to be cremated, which was news to her family. But as her husband, he was the one to make that final decision. Toni's death hit the local news, and within days, the park rangers and police started receiving anonymous letters, 17 in total. These were concerned citizens informing them that Harold's first wife also died under suspicious circumstances, and he should be looked at as a suspect of murder. And that's exactly what they did. They began digging into his past. Who was Harold Henthorn? As I said earlier, Harold worked as a nonprofit fundraiser for churches and hospitals. He had about 90 employees working under him. Supposedly. His business should have a license in the state of Colorado to be operating legally. It did not. His business card said CFRE on it. A certified fundraiser should also be documented and easy to search. Nothing listed for Harold or his business. He was a fraud. They did some digging into the case of his late wife, Lynn Rochelle. Reading through the files, they realized there was so much that did not add up. That night, a man reported seeing Harold pulled over on the side of the road. He stopped to see if he needed some help. Lynn was sitting in the passenger seat of the Jeep with a frightened look on her face. Harold acted very strange and told him to go away. He didn't need his help. Now, if Harold's car jack wasn't working, why wouldn't he take the offer of the Good Samaritan's car jack versus using an unstable boat jack? As far as the tire changing process, you only need to jack a car up far enough to remove the tire. It shouldn't have been so high that Lynn could fit under the axle. Once Harold removed the tire, he carried it around to the rear of the Jeep and threw it into the hatch, with his bad back and all. Why wouldn't he just change the tire first and then put everything away? And if a lug nut rolled under the car, I doubt Lynn, with her rheumatoid arthritis, is squeezing herself under the car far enough that her chest is lined up directly under the axle. And the timing of her hunching down and crawling under the Jeep didn't seem to match Harold walking 5 steps away. After the accident, a couple pulled over to see if they needed help. They saw legs sticking out from under the Jeep and freaked out. The woman reached down to try and pull Lynn out, and Harold screamed at them not to touch her. He seemed very agitated by their presence until an ambulance arrived on the scene. Investigators reenacted the accident as Harold said it happened. They could not get the Jeep to fall by throwing a wheel in the back, or even jumping on the back end. The only thing that caused this reaction is movement from the front end, like pushing down on the front right corner, or manually lowering the jack on purpose. People speculated that Harold forced her under the Jeep, or possibly even sedated her and placed her there. Police interviewed women that Harold dated between his first and second marriage. These women say he was overly interested in their financial situations, and they ultimately ended their relationship due to his controlling behavior. One woman said during a fight, he drove her to a secluded area and said, "I could kill you and dispose of your body where no one would ever find you." Another woman said during a disagreement, Harold pinned her against a wall until she admitted that he was right. A friend of Toni's told police that she believed Harold had tried to kill her once before. Harold, Toni, and Haley were staying in a cabin, again in a remote location where no one was around to witness. Around 10:30 p.m., when Haley was asleep, Harold decided to go outside and clean up. He asked Toni to come out and help him. She came outside on the lower level. Harold from above threw a wooden beam over the edge in her direction. At that very moment, Toni had bent down to pick up a broken piece of glass, and the beam landed on her back. She was taken by ambulance and hospitalized. She made a full recovery, but couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if she hadn't bent over. Things weren't looking good for Harold. But so far, everything was circumstantial evidence. There wasn't any direct proof he killed Toni or Lynn. Toni's family suspected Harold was responsible, but pretended to support him so they could keep an eye on Haley. They were worried if he was capable of murdering his wife, what's stopping him from doing the same to his daughter? Toni's siblings and parents visited often and reported any pertinent information back to the authorities. There was definitely a major concern for Haley's safety, but they had to be smart with this investigation. If they moved too quickly without enough evidence, he could walk. A search warrant was granted for Harold's home and car. He was somewhat of a hoarder when it came to documents, which was good news for the investigation. His tax records showed Harold had no income, 0, since 1992. That's 3 years before Lynn died. The business he started for fundraising? Fake. The weekly business trips? Staged. The man was living a complete lie. Lynn had her own life insurance policy, but just a few months before her death, Harold took out a new one for $300,000, and it doubled in the event of a car accident. So Harold made out with $600,000. In 1995, that was plenty to live on for quite a while. He told investigators that Toni had only one life insurance policy. Also a lie. Over the years of their marriage, he created multiple policies totaling $4.7 million. He was planning to kill Toni from the very beginning. Harold had kept in touch with his previous sister-in-law, Grace Rochelle. She was married to Lynn's brother. Grace and her husband eventually divorced, and she was struggling as a single mom. Harold offered to help her open a policy for her 4 daughters in the event something happened to her. What Grace didn't realize was the policy wasn't for her girls at all. The paperwork she signed was life insurance with Harold as the primary beneficiary. She very well could have been the third victim of Harold Henthorn. One mystery investigators needed to solve was where Harold went every day for work. The nanny cared for Haley every Thursday and Friday while he went on business trips. Well, they found out he spent quite a lot of time at Panera Bread surfing the internet. But more pertinent to the investigation, Harold's cell record shows his phone pinging off towers, driving from his house in Highlands Ranch to Estes Park over and over, for months leading up to Toni's death. His phone went silent for about 6 hours and then showed him driving back home. The weekend before Toni's death, while driving back from Estes Park, he made the call to her office requesting to clear her schedule. He repeatedly hiked the area in search of the perfect spot to kill Toni. When he found it, he made the call to put his plan in motion. Does this 100% prove he killed Toni? No, but all signs point to yes. There was documentation of Harold closing out the account that Toni recently opened. He forged her signature and took the money. At this point, the agents working the case felt they had enough evidence to arrest Harold Henthorne for the murder of his wife, Toni. They wanted to use Lynn's suspicious death against him in court, not to charge him with her murder, just to show that this couldn't be a coincidence. The information was presented to a judge in a pre-trial, and he allowed Lynn's case to be admissible in court. This was a huge win for the prosecution team. I was actually pretty shocked to hear this. Happy, but shocked. Typically, if the information does not pertain directly to the case, it's considered inadmissible. When the trial began, Harold's attorney did not call any witnesses to the stand, only cross-examined those of the prosecutor. He spent most of his time arguing that the case of Lynn's death should not impact the jurors' decision. He made Harold out to be the victim. A man grieving the loss of 2 wives is being blamed for their murders. It's true that you cannot prove the difference between a fall and being pushed, but there was no denying his motive. The jury found Harold Henthorne guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Bertolet and Rochelle families finally felt closure. He appealed to the Supreme Court that he had misrepresentation, but it was denied. One of Toni's brothers and his wife adopted Haley. Her cousins became her siblings, and she has done very well adjusting to her new life. I was so drawn to this case because I expected him to get away with it due to lack of evidence. But thankfully, the jury saw through his lies and put Harold Henthorne behind bars. That's it for this week's episode. If you want all the gritty details on this case, I highly suggest watching Wild Crime, a HULU 4-part original series. On a lighter note, let's do some listener shoutouts. I received a Facebook message from Dick MCD. Bobby, I love your podcast. I stumbled across it by sheer chance looking for something different. I'm completely addicted. You present so well and keep me hanging on every word. I'm from Scotland and wonder if you have any stories from here. Keep up the good work. I will definitely try to find you a Scottish case. Another message sent from Carl Newman said, I'm listening to your work from Colombia and I'm a fan. I like your voice and your style. Keep it up. You're doing a great job. These aren't posted reviews, but I do love getting feedback from my listeners. Feel free to reach out via social media or my email, killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. If you would like to support the show, visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories, or you can click my link tree in the show notes to shop merchandise through Freedom Street Boutique. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.